大家好，非常高兴今天晚上我们就开始我们线上的真理论坛非常难得我是台大的胡文聪老师首先介绍一下真理论坛的起源，在1992年就是30年前了，哈佛大学的学生、教师和牧师策划了第一届的真理论坛。从那时，北美、欧洲跟亚洲的200多所大学已经举办了2000多场的论坛。在台湾，今天是第4届在每一个学期开始之后的大概第4周我们来举办。真理论坛名副其实，它就来自一个字叫做 Veritas V-E-R-I-T-A-S， 那就是哈佛大学的座右铭。在校徽上也看得到，这个字是拉丁文，那就是真理的意思。哈佛大学之所以用真理放在校徽上，是相信可以寻求和发现真理。论坛是指我们致力创造可以公开讨论和分享相关想法的空间所以今天我们就进入真理论坛。我们的贵宾是美国康奈尔大学的 Professor Praveen Sethupathy， 主题是超越基因体 Beyond the Genome What it says about us and what it doesn't， 真是非常期待。我们一起来欢迎 Praveen 教授来加入我们。Praveen, can you turn on your camera, please? Wonderful. All right, Praveen. Yes. I believe it's, what is it, 6:30 in the morning for you?
That's correct, Professor.
Oh, sorry to wake you up. Well, thank you for sacrificing your sleep for Veritas Forum Taiwan. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Can you say hello to our attendees, please?
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Yes.
I'm glad you're here in your case this evening.
Yes. Great. Wonderful. Yeah. If you don't mind, I will say the few words to introduce you in Chinese. All right? Okay. Professor Praveen Sethupathy 是康奈尔大学生物医学副教授跟记忆体中心的主任。他在康奈尔大学毕业，在宾州大学拿到博士学位之后呢，在美国前卫福部部长Dr. Francis Collins 手下的国家人类基因体研究所完成他的博士研究，在2011年居住在北卡，就是 North Carolina 的大学，担任遗传学系的助理教授，然后2017年他就回到康奈尔大学任教。Praveen 教授在期刊上发表了超过115篇的文章非常之不容易，并担任45个不同期刊的审查委员这个是非常荣誉的事情。那最近呢，甚至是荣誉也包括是杰出教学跟指导的教师右翼奖。那 Praveen 教授跟他的妻子有3个小孩所以从教学研究跟父亲的角色应该是非常忙碌的一位人物所以非常感谢他来加入今天晚上。好 So Praveen, perhaps that you can join us later during the Q&A. All right, and then I'll see you. Okay. 好，那今天的这个论坛分开2部分进行。第一部分是播放访谈 Praveen 教授的影片。那访谈人是台大的张俊哲教授，那他也是基因体的专家。第二部分是 Q&A 的时间。
Hi, good morning in the U.S. and good evening in Taipei. And yeah, I'm so glad to see Dr. Praveen Sethupathy here online, and it's so amazing that I can talk with you this evening, of course, on your side this morning. And first, I would like to ask you a question. You have devoted your academic career to studying the human genome. How did you become interested in the study of the genome? and what has kept you engaged and motivated for so many years? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and to everyone else in the audience. That's a really inviting question, and one that has me thinking back to when I first learned about DNA and genome.
Mhm.
Early in my training, I was introduced to this idea that the DNA is the instruction booklet for the cells in our body. But shortly thereafter, I began to wonder if all the cells in our body have the same DNA, how is it, right, that a brain cell knows how to
Yeah.
do something different than a liver cell or a heart cell or a skin cell,
Yeah.
right? And this really basic fundamental question in biology just captivated me.
Yeah.
And it still fascinates me today. Um,
Yeah.
Even some of the most basic facts of DNA that piqued my attention 25 years ago, they
Mhm.
still kind of give me goosebumps today. If you take DNA from just one cell in our
Yeah.
body,
Yeah.
right, and you stretch it out from end to end, it would take up almost 6 feet, which is taller than
Yeah.
I am, right?
Yeah.
And if you take the DNA from all the cells in one person's body and you
Wow.
stretched it out end to end, if there were a way to do that, it'd be hundreds of millions of miles.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it's almost unfathomable. It's from the sun to the earth and back many times over. It's so much material that is so very, very tightly wound and packaged within the cells of just one body. And
Yeah.
I've stared and studied at small pieces of the genome for months at a time.
Yeah.
And often just when I think I've figured out what a little piece does, I'll learn that it might have a completely separate function in a
Mhm.
different setting or different context. And in that way, DNA has been full of surprises, right? And I always find that the information is far more complex and multifunctional than one originally imagines. And
Yeah.
there's a kind of striking parallel here with my experience as a Christian, and maybe some in the audience will resonate with me. I mean, I can't count the number of times I've opened up the Bible to a very familiar passage, even one I may have read hundreds of times.
Yeah.
But because of a new context in my life, it suddenly there's a fresh and a new meaning, something new that I'm learning about,
Yeah.
the character of God. So I think that a shared theme between, my experiences as a student of science and as a follower of Christ is that I never stop learning, right? And whether it's DNA or the Word of God, I don't think I'll ever stop being surprised by what those have to reveal about life.
Yeah. Okay, so coincidentally, while I was a college student, I was studying DNA, studying molecular biology in the Department of Agricultural Chemistry at the Taiwan University. And at that time, because I was studying DNA, I was studying cells, and after that, I studying the DNA sequences, ATGC, and after that, I learned that the DNA sequences are actually have a lot of secrets, and DNA sequences are signals. So that, allow me to see the mystery of life. And actually, that's back to the tonight's topic, um, this DNA and the genome and the genomics. So in 1990s, the Human Genome Project, as we know, was launched, and a collective project of scientists around the world with the goal of mapping all of the genes in the human genome. And in 2000, wow, a working draft of the human genome was announced. And last year, in 2021, the first complete human genome sequence was published with about 3 billion base pairs. And public imagination has been captured by the prospects of understanding who we are as human beings at a fundamental level. And in the broadest brushstrokes, that even non-science majors can understand. What does the genome tell us about who we are? Wow, the question, who we are, and what are some of the most significant insights about human beings made possible through the mapping of the genome? Wow.
Yeah, Dr. Cheng, you're so right. The last 20 years, especially since the first draft of the human genome was published, has been extraordinarily illuminating. Not only because it's allowed us to study what we refer to as the blueprint for biological life, but it's been full of surprises, as you alluded to, things that we did not anticipate about who we are, right? So I think I can perhaps best answer this question by giving a couple of examples that might be kind of surprising and intriguing for the audience. So one example is, it turns out we actually don't have that many genes in our genome,
Yeah,
right? Way
yeah,
less than was originally anticipated. So let's kind of use a comparison here. Even the genome of rice, right? The rice we eat,
yeah,
it contains more genes than we do, than human beings have, right? Specifically, the rice genome has about 45 to 50,000 or so genes, depending on how you count. Whereas the human genome only has about 20 to 25,000 genes, right?
yeah,
That's almost twice as many genes in the DNA of rice
yeah,
compared to human beings, right?
yeah,
So, if you think of genes as kind of tools in a toolkit, it turns out that the complexity of an organism isn't determined by the number of tools that its genome has, but rather how multifaceted its tools are and exactly how and when those tools are used.
hmm,
And I don't know about you in your experiences with genomics, but I've found this to be a kind of interesting parable in a way for spiritual life because um, it's not so much how many things we do for the kingdom of
hmm,
God, but rather how we do them that brings more glory to God. So there's a kind of neat parallel in my experiences as a student of genomics and
yeah,
as a Christian there. Another neat example that the students may be interested in is if you take a close look at the human genome, it turns out that littered throughout the DNA are genetic elements that our best guess is that they originate from other species that we tend to think are completely unlike us, right? So, in fact, a conservative estimate is that at least 10% of our human genome represents sequences from viruses,
yeah,
right, that have long before infected us and integrated their genomes into ours
yeah,
and have become a part of ours over time. And so, in a funny kind of way, even at the genetic level, each of us is almost 1/10 virus, if you will, right? Um, and amazingly, it's not just that the virus is there, sort of in a closet somewhere. They
yeah,
actually have new functions, and they've helped shape some aspects of human biology that um, we kind of take for granted today.
yeah,
There's growing evidence that pieces of viral DNA may actually contribute to the development of the human placenta.
hmm,
And that's fascinating to me. I mean, you have viral DNA that may have helped bring about an organ that's critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb, right? And when we think about Psalm 139, and in this where it says that God knit us together in our mother's womb, the truth of virus pieces contributing to that process, it doesn't take away from God's authorship of our lives. To me, it actually adds a kind of surprising color that I would not have originally anticipated. Who is to say that God can't use viruses to accomplish this, right? So those are some of the really neat
yeah,
things we've been learning as we study the genome.
yeah. And do you know that you mentioned rice and have a double size of genome than human beings? And actually, the grasshopper I was studying for my PhD thesis also has the double amount of DNA bases than our human beings. Yeah, and yeah, it's so amazing, and so many so-called coding or non-coding sequences in our genome. Yeah. So the next question is, so for all of the wonder of the genome, the last part of uh, title tonight implies that the genome cannot tell us everything about who we are. And as a scientist and as a Christian, in what ways do you think the genome is limited in its description of who we are as human beings? And what kinds of knowledge or realities are missing from a purely genetic description of a human being?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cheng. I think that's a really interesting and important question, um, because there's so much to learn from the study of the genome, and I don't think I will barely scratch the surface for the rest of my life. So I don't want to give the impression that the genome cannot teach us copious amounts about who we are as biological entities, our history, our present, our predispositions, our future. It can really be extraordinarily illuminating. But I do believe that genomics and science in general has limitations in terms of what it can address about who we are. Right?
Yeah.
Let me give you just an example, even from biology, that might kind of start the conversation there. It's been proposed by a lot of people that perhaps we can define humans simply as a collection of cells, right? Basically, a slightly sophisticated bag of cells with human DNA, right? And this seems kind of simple and elegant and compelling, but there are really a lot of problems, even just biologically, with this approach. So, probably many of you in the audience today, you know that one of the most remarkable discoveries in human biology in the past decade and a half or so, um, coincident with advances in genomics, is that our bodies are home to tens of trillions of microorganisms, mostly bacteria, but other kinds of microorganisms as well.
Yeah.
Tens of trillions. It's a
Yeah.
really staggering number, right? When you stop and think about it, because if you put it in another way, slightly more than half of the cells in a human body, mine or
Mhm.
yours, they're actually not human at all.
Yeah, actually,
Right?
yeah,
And,
yeah,
and these bacteria, they're not just there like the viral pieces in our genome. They're actually critical for the healthy functioning
yeah,
of human organs like skin and intestine. Right? We could not properly absorb nutrients or
mm,
maintain energy without the bacteria living inside us. Right? So there's this incredibly rich, complex symbiosis going on, and without those bacteria, we wouldn't quite be who we are. Right? So even from a strictly biological sense, um, a human can't really be defined by a collection of human cells alone, right? There
mm,
is an interconnectedness and relationship with other beings, most that we cannot even see with the naked eye, that contributes to who we are, right? So it's already more complicated, and we haven't even gotten into the spiritual side of things, right?
yeah,
So, whether it's the microbiome in our bodies or the pieces of viral DNA found in our genomes, um, I think biology keeps bringing to light a fundamental connectedness among
yeah,
different life forms, but we cannot even, people with a faith based persuasion or even atheists I've found in my circle can't seem to shake that there is something different about us humans, right?
yeah,
We uh, uniquely seem to crave answers to questions about purpose and meaning. Um, and I think we uniquely are creating Veritas forums around the world to sit around and have these discussions, right? And these are exactly the kinds of questions that science is not equipped to tackle. I don't believe it has the tools to tackle it.
yeah,
And maybe I can just end with one kind of point here. I don't want to end by saying that science can't tackle it and therefore we can't know. I think the reality is that there are other ways of knowing.
mhm,
And this is where I think the book of Genesis offers a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
because during the telling of how the universe came to be, the phrase image of God is used only for one species. I mean, this is the idea that seems to kind of separate us.
Yeah.
Um, and for those who are interested, there's a fascinating book called The Liberating Image by Dr. Richard Middleton, who's a Bible scholar and a theologian. And he defines the image of God as the royal office of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. And so, in a sense, we're called to manifest and channel the character of God, kind of priestly service, right, toward the rest of creation. And I think that gives us this flavor that the image of God, this thing that might separate us, is not a biological feature. It's not something encoded in our genomes. It's not a gene or two that we can discover. It's a vocational calling, right, that is gifted to us by our Maker. And I think this is kind of really what sets us apart, what leads us to sit here and have these kinds of discussions. I think there are contributions to that from our biology and our genetics, but it's not the whole picture.
Yeah, yeah. Indeed, when you were talking about the meaning of life and the meaning of the genes, and it inspired me to think about a term called junk genes in a textbook of genetic and molecular biology about 30 years ago. You still can you could find the term junk genes, but nowadays, amazingly, no molecular biology textbooks, no genetics textbooks to identify a gene is a junk. And so, which means that now gradually the human being find every single gene has its own meaning. That's fascinating. And I think the life is made of the meaningful things. Yeah. So the next question is, you have spoken at numerous Veritas forums at university across the United States on the relationship between science and faith. While that is not a focus of this interview tonight, I won't be surprised if that questions come up during our Q&A time. Could you share with us how you see science and faith interacting with each other in the search of truth, and what common ground do they share, and what can one bring to the other? Thanks.
Thank you so much for asking that question. It is a passion of mine. It is something that I've spoken about a lot, and I'm always delighted to keep speaking about it because there is this pervasive and growing, unfortunately, misconception that science and faith are at odds. I'm especially acutely aware of how true this is in America. Perhaps the students in the audience will have a better sense for what the landscape is like in Taiwan. But it's a very unfortunate trajectory because if you look at the past, right, and especially if you view through the lens of individuals and not so much institutions, right, science and faith have actually long been very productive co-laborers, if you will, in the pursuit of truth, right? And Dr. Chang, you alluded to the same in your question. And there are many, many examples of this. So Mary Anning, some of you in the audience may know, she changed the way that scientists think about prehistoric life. She was a devout Christian, right? Or Johannes Kepler, who established the laws of planetary motion. And there are many people, not just from the West, but from the East. And these are scholars whose work was motivated by a strong belief in a loving God of order and creativity, right? These people, they didn't just kind of fall into science. I mean, they were actually driven to science because of an insatiable desire to learn about and then celebrate together with others, the creative God. And whatever the scientific lens happened to reveal to them, it didn't push God outside of their worldviews. Instead, it just gave them a window into just how much more amazing God is than they had ever previously appreciated. Right? I really think, and I can give you many examples of this if you're interested, but woven throughout Scripture is a core truth that at the heart of creation is God's joy. Joy is really central to me when I think about
Yeah.
where science and faith meet, right? I think God has been taking uh, an immense amount of pleasure in his creation from the very beginning. And what's really cool is that humankind seems to be that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in creation right alongside our creator.
Yeah.
I just, we uniquely we get to peer into and make known what Scripture calls the manifold wisdom of God, and to draw near to God's joy in that experience of creation. And for me, at the end of the day, and Dr. Chang, perhaps you experienced this too as a scientist. This is what the scientific enterprise is about for me. It doesn't um, it doesn't take away from my humanness.
Mm.
I actually find that it encourages it. It persuades me every day to be open-eyed
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
all the overabundance of created things, the vastness of the created order, right? The
Yeah.
diversity and complexity of
Yeah.
biological life. I mean, I think we're meant to explore, to wonder, to be in awe in a way that I don't think any other animal is, however special each of his created things are.
Mhm.
I really think a lot of it is there simply because God enjoys it. And
Yeah.
as humans made in his image, as I was alluding to earlier, I think we're
Yeah.
called to discover it and enjoy it too. Johannes Kepler said, um, I'm just thinking God's thoughts after him, when I make scientific discoveries, right? There's a sense of taking deep pleasure in creation that I think strongly links my experience as a scientist and as a Christian. There's a quote that comes to mind here that I'll end with. This quote is actually from an atheist. Okay, his name is Henri Poincaré. He's a really brilliant French mathematician from the 19th century.
Mhm.
He happened to be an atheist, and he said, "The scientist does not study nature just because it is useful to do so. He studies it, and I might add, she studies it, because he takes pleasure in it. And he takes pleasure in it because it is beautiful."
Yeah.
I mean, although he was an atheist, I think he could not escape this feeling that humans seem to have a unique privilege
Mm.
of experiencing wonder and delight and beauty in nature. And I really think this is where science and faith, they actually meet as friends, not foes.
Okay. Yeah. The last question this evening or this morning is before we move to our Q&A time tonight. As scientists, we have both experienced that exploring hard questions require courage and resilience. Could you share about the challenge of pursuing truth in science and how courage and resilience have also played a role in your pursuit of spiritual truth? Thanks.
That's also a big
Good
question and
question.
great question. And I'm sure maybe I'll just give a couple of examples that come to mind, but I would be happy to expand on any of those during Q&A if there's interest
Yeah.
from the students. Um, I think perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is soon after I became a Christian, and this is more of a personal story. It was a very challenging time. Um, I come from a tradition of Hindu Brahmins,
Mhm.
and there aren't a whole heck of a lot of conversions from Hindu Brahmanism to Christianity. It's very, very rare. And even in the past 25 years, I've only come across a few examples. Um, and a lot of that is because Brahmins have a very somber task of carrying the torch of the Hindu faith across the generations. And they've done an extraordinary job of that. And so to leave that faith tradition as a um, as a belief system, right, to live by, is a major decision, and one that people in the community um, have a very difficult time understanding. And
Mhm.
this is especially so because Christianity can sometimes be associated with the religion of the oppressor, right? Colonial oppressors, and others in the past. So the courage and the resilience part for me had to do with digging deep at a time when those whom I loved the most around me
Mhm.
thought I was rejecting them, and thought that I was rejecting my Indianness or my culture. But in truth, I was not rejecting any of those things. In
Yeah.
truth, I became even more in love with
Yeah.
who God made me to be,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even more passionate about being the best version of myself. Um,
Mhm.
um, but there was a lot of pain in that time, but that pain forced me to, as I said, really dig deep about who God is and what He's calling me to, right? And what I learned during that initial period is that God is not interested in changing my name, changing my culture,
Mhm.
changing my language, changing my what I wear. These are not things that He cares about about changing. I think He is happy with all the cultural traditions that have sprung up from different corners of the earth. Um, I think rather He is making a claim to my heart, right? And
Mhm.
He's saying, "You are mine, and and I am yours." And therein is the heart of the gospel, that we know Him through the image of the invisible God in Christ Jesus. Um, and digging deep to understand that at a
Mhm.
visceral level helped me to be able to get through the pain, um,
Mhm.
and come out the other side and be able to um, work through those misconceptions with the people I loved the most. It took 10 years, 15 years in some cases to work through those things with the people around me.
Yeah.
Another example I might share before I close this part is um, also being a person of faith in a academic and scientific setting can sometimes be challenging, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes you might have colleagues that view your beliefs as archaic or silly,
Mhm.
or they might even question the rigor and strength and value of your work if they feel like you believe in these things that science cannot prove. Um, but I have found repeatedly that over time, being patient,
Yeah.
and um, building relationships and
Yeah.
being secure in who I am
Yeah.
has allowed me to be able to not necessarily change everyone's minds,
Mhm.
but to build a strong foundation, and to help people experience cognitive dissonance, right?
Mhm.
That after a certain amount of time, they might come to respect me as an educator or as a scientist or as a colleague or as a
Yeah.
collaborator.
Yeah.
And I think that forces good conversations about why and how it is that I still believe in, things like the
Mhm.
resurrection of Christ, right? And those conversations are good. They're healthy for me to challenge myself, and they're healthy for them to think outside of the boxes they've created as well. So I hope that is at least a start to an answer to the question.
Yeah. Yeah. Could I ask you one more question? Um, yeah. So, what you were talking about to find the best, you find out the best version of yourself. Wow, that sentence really inspired me. But do you know that when I first was invited to interview, I read your short CV, learning that you were working with Dr. Francis Collins, the former director of the NIH. And do you know, actually, I am a fan of Collins. And yeah, I love his singing, I love his speech. And when you were working with Francis Collins, during the process, um, how much were you influenced by Collins, and or what kind of things or kind of sentences, words you talk and that inspire you? I'm very curious to learn. Thanks.
Dr. Chang, thank you for the question. Um, I am still influenced and still learning from Francis because of the time that I spent with him as a trainee and postdoctoral fellow. Um, I would have to say that in my professional life, he is far and away the most influential person in my life. And it is not because he is brilliant. He is, but that is not the primary reason. Um, the primary reason is that I got to watch him and how he treated people as a leader, right? Motivated by his faith and in a humble understanding of who he is as a child of God. I
Yeah.
never ever once saw him treat anyone differently based on their position and status in this world.
Wow. Wow.
That is exceedingly rare among people of his worldly stature.
Okay.
It is very rare to find someone who doesn't become at least a little bit self-absorbed,
Yeah.
doesn't become a little bit full of themselves or need their ego stroked. He's not a perfect man. No one is. But that's precisely what I find so compelling about him is that he knows that on a daily basis, right?
Mhm.
And that motivates him um, to remind himself about what his calling is, right? And that is ultimately a calling to be an agent of healing and a minister of reconciliation with all peoples, not just those that have power in our worldly hierarchies.
Okay.
Right?
Wow. Great.
One of the things he told me um, when I was a trainee with him, I asked him this question. You know, there's so much that's written about you in the press. Some people love and adore you and can't ever find anything wrong with you. And other people seem to despise you and have so much vitriol against you. How do you maintain a sense of how do you get through that?
Yeah.
And he said, Praveen, every day I remind myself I'm not as great as what some people say I am, and I'm not as bad as what some people say I am. I'm just a man, right, who is trying to do the very best that I can to fulfill the calling placed in my life. That's all that's happening here. And
Wow.
reminding myself of that on a daily basis helps me to keep balance. And
Okay.
that lesson, simple lesson, has stuck with me even today.
Okay. Good. I love that word calling. And thank you so much, Praveen, tonight for being so willing to share your wisdom, share what you have experienced, share your story. And then I think the audience must very much look forward to the Q&A time. And I think we should open for question to them. And thank you so much tonight. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to the questions.
他是台湾大学。那the question he has is that why don't you go ahead and ask your question, Etiquette?
Hello, Professor Praveen. First of all, I would like to thank you for providing us such a great informative session. So my question is, as we all know that the complete human genomics has mapped out. So now how it is helping in molecular medicine to cure the diseases right now, the challenging diseases which we have, any kind of neurodegenerative disease. So how it is helping that?
Yeah. Aniket, nice to meet you. Great question. There are many ways in which understanding the full human genome is helping in the development of new medical therapeutics. Dr. Wu, would you like to translate?
Oh yes，有许多的一些这个需要思考的哈，就是说其中一个呢，就是说是medical 的这个you said medical therapeutics is that right？
Yes.
就是来寻找适当的药物来治疗。Go ahead.
One of the most compelling ways is by trying to understand natural variation in the human genome across different populations. Right? The advent about 15 years ago or so of genome-wide association studies, you may have heard of these or studied these. These are large-scale genetic studies in human populations around the world that are helping us to understand what genetic variations are responsible or associated with the development of which complex diseases. Right? So that has been really helpful in being able to determine whether we might be able to read out someone's genome and ascertain the level of risk that they might have for some complex disease like cardiovascular disease or psychiatric conditions, etc.
确实是许多的一些工作已经在进行哈，比如说就是这个整个基因体的一个计划哈，就是有大量的在人体中哈已经是进展了，但是其中一个很关键的问题就是说，就是不同的人群哈，可能是有不同的一些基因体的一些重要性哈，那必须要了解到这些人群间的一些差异哈，就是比较可以了解，比如说心脏病啊，或者是一些精神病啊，或其他的症状来去找适当的药物。
But Aniket, what I would say is even more than that. The field of genomics has realized that as I was alluding to in my talk, a very small portion of the genome is actually encoding for genes that make proteins. A lot of the rest of the genome, what we call the non-coding genome, it's filled with all kinds of different elements. We call them regulatory elements, but they are basically like dials or switches that can control the level of activation of nearby genes. It turns out that most of the genetic variants that can increase your risk for complex diseases, they land not as much in the genes as they land in these dials, in these regulatory elements. So learning about where the regulatory elements are and which genes they're controlling has given us a better idea about the molecular networks that are driving different diseases, thereby helping us to be able to develop better medicines against those diseases.
好，刚刚 Praveen 教授有提到说是在我们的基因体里面呢，其实是小部分的基因会制造人体中所需要的蛋白，大部分的基因呢就是不会有所去表现的，或者是 non-coding 或者是 regulatory 这些基因。但是呢，现在我们可以理解到说，这些非常复杂的疾病相关的是这些有所不见得是直接会有所表现的，就是这些 non-coding 跟 regulatory 其实是非常重要的，确实有些关键的角色的那这些我们深入了解，才比较知道说制药如何去有所去这个有所帮助，好找到好的药。Okay, great, thank you, Aniket.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Praveen.
好，第二个问题是周正宇同学台大他问的问题是为什么人类是神创造的，但是却还是有坏人？好，那可以麻烦这个相关的可以麻烦正宇同学来发问。好，正宇同学，请打开你的镜头。好，正宇同学，你在吗？好，我们就到下一位好了。好，下一位是 Augustine Lee 李同学也是台大的李同学，麻烦您打开你的镜头。好，正宇同学来了是麻烦正宇你先发问好了，请。
Hello, Professor.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah,
中文或英文都可以。
Can I ask my question in Chinese? Yeah. 为什么人类是神创造的，但是却还是有坏人呢？是跟 人类它本来的基因有关，还是跟后天的生活环境影响比较有关呢？谢谢。Thank you.
All right, the question is that humans are created by God. Then how come that they are still bad guys? Is it related to our genes, or is it that things that we have acquired after our birth?
Yes. So, first of all, great question. And this is a question that humanity, I think, has been struggling with for as far back as there is any record of humanity. In one sense, you might call this the problem of evil, right? If you're interested in this question, you can learn more from the writings of C.S. Lewis, who has written about this, but also N.T. Wright. These are theologians who have thought deeply about this particular problem. I can stop there and say more after you translate, Dr. Wu.
OK， 呀，这个是非常深的问题，而且也是人类有史以来都在问的问题。好，那先介绍两个作者，好，一个是 C.S. Lewis， 好，那另外一个是 N.T. Wright， 啊，这两位都是相当的这个被肯定，好，可以充分的回答这个所谓的这个恶的来源的问题。
For me, the key issue is, what is God's heart in creation? When he makes us, when he creates us, he does so by giving us free will. He loves us, but he would like us to love him in return out of our own volition, out of our own free will, because it is good and loving and wonderful and joyful and purposeful for us. Not because he is forcing us to, not because he is making us to, because if he did, then it wouldn't be love. To God, love is an ultimate ideal. And while he desires to have loving relationship with all of his creation, they must choose to love him back if that love is going to be real. The problem is, many of us don't. And I don't mean to say there are bad guys and good guys. Even within each of us, there is a strain that tries to reject him or rebel against him. And so, while that strain can be really painful and can lead to all kinds of disastrous consequences for humanity, I think God somehow deems that it is worth it for the chance that some humans may love him back and have relationship with him. So that's one thing that comes to mind. There's one other thing I want to say on this, but maybe Professor Wu, you can translate that portion.
Yes. 可能一个很核心的就是我们要问说，上帝在创造的心意是什么？好，那我觉得就是让我们可以自由的选择。好，那我们自由可以选择去爱上帝，也毕竟他创造我们。当然，我们也可以选择不去爱他。那神没有强迫我们选择去爱他，如果有的话，这个就不是爱了。好，那所以我们必须有所去自由选择。好。那其实这个呢，不是好人或坏人的问题，就讲你我好了。好，那我们呢都需要有所选择，但是问题是我们在我们自我里面呢，我们都有个拉扯。好，我们就会有所去想说，要不要爱神，还是不要爱神。Go ahead.
When we say that something is evil or bad, we are only able to say that because there's something in us that knows what is good, right? Like it's all relative. So there has to be something that's contrasting. And to me, that has always been a pointer to God. How is it that we know something is bad or evil? Where is that kind of moral guidance and instruction coming from? That's not a direct answer to your question, but I do think that it may shift the question a little bit to, instead of why is there evil, what can I do about that evil? As a child of God, what is God calling me to do to step up and serve on the side of the oppressed, to step up and fill the world that can have so much evil with the good that comes from knowing Him.
OK， 好，就是那个good 跟 evil 啊，好跟坏的事情呢，其实刚刚讲说我们心中有拉扯，但是呢，其实我们会知道什么是好的，什么是我们该做的。我想这个呢，其实是帮助我们去朝上帝的一个方向来去思考。好，那所以呢，就其实这个问题，您提的问题呢，就是可以稍微去调整一下，就是说我们如果稍微知道是什么是我们该做的，那问题就是说我们是否是可以去做帮助人的事情，去有所助人的事情。好，那这个就是其实是我们在这个好跟坏之间有所选择去做该做的事了。Go ahead.
Yep, that's it from me. Yeah.
All right, good. 哎，张宇同学，这样可以吗
OK， 谢谢，Thanks a lot。
谢谢。好，
拜拜。
OK， 好，下一位就是Augustine 李同学哈，这个台大的那个 Augustine，可以麻烦你打开你的镜头来发问，好不好？
Hello, Professor
中
Praveen。
文或英文都可以。
好，我想先谢谢 Professor Praveen 为我们带来这么精彩的演讲。那我想要请问，就是在您多年的研究中，有没有什么问题让您曾经想过要放弃？然后您是如何振作起来？及就是身为一个基督徒，您是如何解读失败的？这样，谢谢。
Okay, 好。Thank you very much for an excellent talk. My question is that I want to ask you, through the many years of research, have you encountered problems that you want to give up? And how do you boot yourself up to face up the issue? And how do you read the so-called failure that you had?
Wow, Austin, that's a great question. There are many times where we have taken on a project, and somewhere along the way, we start to think that perhaps we are not making as much progress on the project as we'd like, and we consider the possibility of setting it aside in favor of other projects. You may have heard that one should never quit too early on one's efforts. So we never abandon a project early, because the twists and turns that are present in scientific research, they can take you in all kinds of new directions that you may not have even anticipated in the beginning, if you just hold on long enough to experience them. So we try to give projects a healthy amount of time to progress before we decide to move on. However, we also must know, as sophisticated scientists, we need to balance with the reality that sometimes we are simply not getting the bang for the buck, meaning we are spending lots of money and resources and time, but it may become clear that we simply don't have the tools or the resources or the technology to really answer the question the way that we want. And if that becomes clear, it is a wise decision, not a bad decision, to cut your losses and shift toward other questions that are better fits. I don't view that as failure. I think that, especially as a Christian, every honest and sincere and thoughtful attempt is redeemable. There's something to learn. Even if we didn't end up answering the question of interest, something happened along the way. We worked in a team, we built relationships, we might have learned something else that we didn't anticipate. So I'm always open to the possibility that God is teaching me something, even if it is a project that I decide to ultimately abandon in favor of something else. So it's never a waste.
OK， Professor Praveen 的回应哈，就是说一旦开始一个方向哈，他就不轻易有所放弃， 一定会给他适当的时间哈，有所去深入的来进行研究。好，但是呢，必定是一个平衡了。好，就是如果是困难持续的存在，而在评估是否足够的资源、足够的钱和各方面，然后就有所获得的这个进展是真的很有限的时候呢，就会诚实的来去评估是否是需要有所停损。好，那整个这个过程下来呢，他并不会觉得这是一个所谓的失败了，因为是任何有所这诚实的去评估、审慎的思考都会有所益处的。所以随时他会对上帝的一些带领在整个过程中学到什么样的功课，都会保持一个开放的态度，因为一定是有益处的。好 ，Austin， 这样 OK 吗？有没有其他的想再问的？
不会，我觉得回答很好，谢谢。
Okay, so very good. That's a
Thank
good
you.
answer for me. So thank you very much. OK，
谢谢。
好，谢谢 Austin。好，谢谢 Austin。好，下一位是陈尚甫同学这个也是台大的。好，那个陈同学来，您来发问。
Nice to meet you, Professor. I have a question.
Okay.
如果神是爱人的话，那为什么会有那么多战争和迫害？那就是也祝福乌克兰的战争可以平息。谢谢。
Okay. The question is that if God is love, how come there are so many wars and sufferings? And also would bless that the war in Ukraine could soon end.
Yes, I have the same prayer. I too pray that the war in Ukraine will soon end. It also, war like this reminds me of the sufferings of people all across the world, in many different continents, some of which we never hear about because it doesn't have the same economic impact on our lives in the world. But those lives matter just as much too. So it's deeply painful to think about the pain, the suffering that we inflict on one another. And so thank you for the question, and I share deeply your prayer. Perhaps you could translate that, Dr. Wu, and I'll answer.
Yeah, 谢谢你提问哈。那我的祷告也是一样哈，正是非常之期待哈，在乌克兰的战争可以早日的平息哈。那其实呢，是在世界各地还有许多的战争，有许多人受到灾难。那些人的生命是跟乌克兰或者任何其他的地方的一样的有所这个重要。好，那所以就真是很盼望这个跟您的祷告一样，所以这个许多的战争赶快有所平息。Okay.
So, this is such a serious question, and it's not one that I want to dismiss by a quick answer, which is why I keep suggesting, as I did to the first questioner, that you may want to read in much more depth on this problem, the problem of evil and the problem of pain that other theologians have thought about for their entire lives and have written about. So I encourage you to check out some of that literature. C.S. Lewis, again, is one example. But I will come back to my answer that the very fact that God is love begs the question of what love is. If we are to be in a loving relationship with God, then we must have the choice to love God, right? If I force my wife to be in a relationship with me and to be married to me, then it is not love, right? It may be something else, but it is not love. If it's only when I give her the choice to love me and I have the choice to love her that it can be said that we are in a loving relationship. It's the same way with God. he gives us a choice to love him. And that choice is offered to us because he is love. He presents himself to us and says, I will always love you. I want you to step into a loving relationship with me. But you're not a robot. You're not going to be forced. You are a sovereign entity with your free will. You can choose to love me or not. I hope you do. I wish you do. And when you do, you will find your purpose and your meaning in me. And I think it is in that context that we will also see other people through the eyes of Christ. But if we choose not to, we choose our own stomachs, we choose our own greed, our own fame, our own uh, uh, um, sort of worldly pursuits, and we rebel against him. We say we don't want him. I feel like that is the start. That is the beginning of the kind of evil that we see in the world, the kind of propensity that we can detect around us in the way that we treat one another so horribly. So while that may not be much of a comfort to such horrible things going on in the world, it always reminds me that God has given me a choice. I'm going to choose love. And as part of the kingdom of heaven on earth, I want to see that we can counteract the evil that's present as a strain among all of us by inviting and asking God's love to be more powerful.
OK， 这个问题是相当的深哈。那我不想简单的有所去这个把它这个有所打发了哈。所以其实呢，这个罪恶跟痛苦的问题呢，其实许多的神学家是花了一生来探讨的啊。那再提就是 C.S. Lewis 的这位先生哈。那但是呢，我还是需要稍微回应一下哈。就是神确实是爱，那我们要问的是什么是爱呢？那我想再强调一下，就是说，爱呢是必须要一个关系的。那神呢绝对不会强迫我们去爱他。如我也没有办法强迫我的太太来爱我，那这个根本就不是爱嘛，不是出于他心甘情愿的爱嘛。所以跟神也是一样。那神呢是让我们去选择，他是爱我们的没有错，但是我们可以选择去爱他或者不爱他。因为神希望有一个我们的这个自然的一个选择去爱或是不爱他。那这个就是真爱的。那如果你选择去爱他的话，那你会找到人的生命的意义，那就是在基督里面的。那如果我们选择不是爱他，那这个是有后果的。那其中后果呢，就是刚这个您所提到的，其实许多的战争啊，许多的这个伤害啊，就是出于人的自我的一些后果了。那所以我想我要回复就是说是这个我们就可以做的就是说去选择去爱别人，选择去做好的事情，来去这个反抗和 counteract 这个就是坏的事情了。这个是我们可以做的。不晓得上普同学这样子是否是你有其他的问题？
满意，谢谢。
满意 ，OK， is satisfied， OK， great， thank you。好，谢谢上普同学。好，下一位是辅神的这个 Clara 傅同学。这个 Clara， 你就麻烦你就打开你的镜头来发问，好吧 ，Clara。OK， 你打开麦克风，麻烦。好。
Okay. Hello, Professor. I'm Claire Fu. So I have some questions about you. It's about if you heard about the movement of transhumanism. Yeah, okay. So I have some questions about the movement of transhumanism and the genetic engineering. Because we know that CRISPR-Cas9, the skill of CRISPR-Cas9 has been found by two scientists, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. And now people discuss a lot about to design a perfect baby, etc. And the transhumanists, they are very happy to hear about the skill of CRISPR-Cas9 because it's a very, very good development for them. So I just want to know about your opinion about the genetic manipulation and the transhumanism. Thank you.
OK，
Thank you.
好，
Thank you.
Claire 的问题就是说是针对这个 transhumanism 哈，就是说是可以有所去用基因的方式来去改变这个人的基因的构造哈。那就也提到这个 CRISPR-Cas 的这个基因的一个技术是出自2位科学家的啊，那甚至是可以用来去就是设计这个婴孩了哈，甚至是哈。那想了解这个 Professor Praveen 对 genetic engineering 的看法Praveen?
Yep. Thank you, Claire. Very, very nice and important question. For those of you on the call who aren't familiar with CRISPR-Cas9, very quickly, I can describe it as a kind of genetic scissors. It's a way to snip a piece of our DNA and replace it with something else. Right? We sometimes refer to it as genome editing or genetic engineering, as Claire said. And the question is, what do I think about this? How can this, is this technology good or is this technology bad? My answer to most questions about whether a technology is good or bad is that the technology itself doesn't have any sort of moral containment. It's not in and of itself good or bad. It's how human beings decide to use it. What is our motivation for using the technology? How are we doing it? Right? Are we doing it equitably with equal access, etc.? So why we're doing it and how we're doing it, generally speaking, I have found are questions that God is much more interested in than actually what we are doing most of the time, right? The power, we have been doing genetic engineering in biomedical science for a really long time. But the reason why we are now talking about it is because the CRISPR-Cas9 technology allows us to do it much more accurately, in a much more cheap way, and in a way that could potentially be applied to human embryos. It's those reasons that we are now all talking about it. But I just want to reiterate that the idea of, in a research setting, editing the genome for research purposes is not new, and in fact has been one of the best tools that the biomedical community has for studying the roles of different genes in our genome. But the question now becomes, how should we be applying the CRISPR-Cas9 technology going forward with the kinds of applications that people are talking about? Professor Wu, I can get to the second part after you translate.
All right, sure. 简单说，这个 CRISPR-Cas9 的这个技术呢，就是这个基因的剪刀，哈，可以把一些基因剪掉，然后呢，也可以用来去用别的基因呢有所代替，好，就是这个基因的一个编辑的一个工具，哈。那我常常会说是这个技术本身呢不是好或坏，好，反而是说这个技术是中性的。那是到底是我们是如何去用它，跟为什么去用它？好，我想神比较会多这个在乎的就是我们是如何用跟为什么用，并非是什么样子的技术。好，那其实呢，在这个 CRISPR-Cas9 之前呢，其实有许多的基因的这个剪辑的技术了，但是呢，因为 CRISPR-Cas9 可以更准确、更便宜的来去编辑基因，哈，所以现在就非常之红，啊，所以导致基因的这个编辑和 genetic engineering 呢，就是相当的热的一个话题。Okay,
So the three main uses of CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing right now, or that we're discussing as a community, one is for research purposes, two is for what's called somatic genome editing, And the third is for what's called germline genome editing. And I'll explain each of these. The research purposes is not really controversial at all. As I explained, this has been happening for a long time, and CRISPR-Cas9 really just democratizes genome editing. It allows more people to do it better, cheaply. Right? The second category is what I call somatic genome editing. So that is, imagine a fully grown human, and we decide to make changes in their genome in just a particular organ of the body, just in the liver, or just in the bone, or something like that, in order to try to correct a disease. In fact, this is already happening. Many of you may know about a horrible disease called sickle cell anemia that has not had a cure. And it looks as though CRISPR-Cas9 based genome editing could actually be the cure for sickle cell anemia. We don't know for sure, but there are some patients that have been treated in this way with their full consent. And so far, the results are very, very encouraging. This is a disease that is endemic to sub-Saharan Africa and also Central and South America. It's a really devastating disease. If we can cure this disease and improve the quality of life for so many people, I think that would be a wonderful thing. The why and the how, I think, really aligns very well with the calling God has placed in our lives. The third category, however, is called germline editing. This is where you edit human embryos. And you can envision doing this to try to remedy diseases that that embryo may ultimately develop. But you can also envision doing this to try to create designer babies, to have blonde hair and blue eyes, or to try to select for traits. This is where it gets extremely problematic and reminds me of times in the past where even scientists have unfortunately been a part of racial discrimination, prejudice, bias, and promoting certain kinds of people above others. For example, eugenics movement was really strong in America, unfortunately, and was in large part supported by some scientists who wanted to use technology to promote those ideas. It's in the context of germline editing that I think the scientific community needs to be really careful. These embryos obviously cannot provide consent. We don't even have a legal framework in place, because if you make a DNA change in the germline, it's not just for that person, but for everybody in their lineage. We don't even have a legal framework in place for those kinds of changes. But there are serious ethical considerations. How do we regulate this process so that people with bad intentions are not going to be able to leverage the technology for ways in which unethical and inequitable purposes? I think that we can, as a scientific community, form a consensus, but we need to slow down. We need to slow down and form a consensus first. This is one of the many reasons why Christians in the sciences is very important, because our voice here about our ethical considerations and concerns are important to be heard.
OK， 这个针对这个 CRISPR-Cas 现在的用处呢，大概可以分3类。第一个就是研究用的，好，那这个基本上是不是一个议题？好，那基本上就是纯粹研究的一个多了解这个生命的一些构造啊。第二个点呢，就是所谓的 somatic genomic 的这个 editing 了。那个意思说是当一个长大的一个人体啊，如一个成人，他的肝、他的骨髓有任何的一些疾病，那就是 CRISPR-Cas9 可以做这个治病的一个调整了。举个例子，就是所谓的 sickle cell anemia， 这是镰刀性的贫血症。那这个症状呢是没有药可医的。那现在的 许多的一些证据是看得到是这个CRISPR-Cas9 的是有机会可以提供这个症状的一个这个治疗哈，比如说比较是非洲的人种或是中美洲的人种哈，那可以让他们的生活有所去改变哈。那这个也是刚刚所提的，是我们如何去用这个工具，跟为什么用这个工具的很好的例子哈。那所以在这个点上，我是绝对是支持用 CRISPR-Cas9 是有所去这个治愈的哈。那第三个用途的所谓的 germline mutation、germline editing 呢，这个意思说是针对人体的一个这个最小的一个在妈妈里面的这个 embryo 哈，就是这个细胞，然后呢就有所去调整它，比如说希望有金头发、蓝眼睛啊，好，那或者是其他的一些这个希望有的一个情况的时候，其实这个就最大的问题的，因为问题就是说是并非由这个法律上的一些这个充分的有所考量，好，那伦理上也未充分的有所讨论啊，所以其实我是建议我们必须要稍微慢一点啊，来去深入思考这个问题，再有所进展这个 germline 的这个 editing 的啊。所以身为基督徒呢，我就是真是鼓励来去深入的有所思考这样子的一个应用，然后才在有所定调之后呢，再决定到底这个是否是适当的一个应用了。好。
May I have a last question?
Okay, 好，请。
My last question is about we talk about the ethics dimension. So in your university, do you have the course to teach the students to think about the dimension about the ethics? And also among the scientists, among the professors like you, do you have usually a meeting to discuss the ethic problem about the CRISPR-Cas9 or genetic manipulation, etc. In our Faculty of Theology, we have a course to discuss properly this problem in our faculty. Thanks a lot.
OK， 好 ，Claire 有那个相关的问题哈。第一个就是说，你们有没有伦理相关的一些讨论哈？那有没有一个课程来去相关伦理的？第三个就是你们的教授里面有没有常常讨论这样子的议题哈？那在 Claire 的这个神学院里面呢，确实是非常之热，非常之这个有内容的有所讨论哈。Praveen？
Claire, it's like you're reading my mind. The short answer is not really. But the extended answer is this is one of my main missions over the course of the next 2 years. I serve as the director of the Center for Genomics at Cornell. I have just written a proposal submitted to the provost of the university to develop an entire seminar series and workshop series focused on the trainees. I am really concerned that we give world-class training in genomics, but we are not equipping the trainees to think about the ethical considerations and the societal implications of the work that they are either doing or the work their colleagues are doing. It's extraordinarily important, in my view, that they spend time wrestling with these questions, understanding the concerns of other scientists and the lay community. I have put together short courses and workshops and seminar series that will speak to this topic. And it's something that we are already doing on this campus in the engineering school. And I would like to mirror that in the context of the biomedical and life sciences arena. So I hope that in 2 to 3 years, I will be able to tell you the answer is yes.
OK， 是Praveen 说是哇 ，Claire 你真的是可以很了解我在想什么哈。那其实伦理的相关的讨论就是我这个2年内就希望可以专注的一个议题了。好，其实我是刚写的一个计划书，希望说学校是可以 让许多受训的研究者，好，不但是在技术面上有充分的训练，而且在伦理上啊，就是要去深度的思考这样子的一个议题。好，那所以有短课程啊，有外勤讲员呢等等来去做这样事情了。好，这非常感谢你的提问。
Thanks God. Pray for you, Professor. Goodbye.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Clara. Oh, time is running really short. Okay. Let's have one last question. 那个玉涵玉涵，你就麻烦你，我想你也等了很久了哈。玉涵，你就麻烦你打开镜头来发问。
Hi, it's an honor to meet you, Professor. I would like to ask, I was a biology student like 20 years ago, and we were learning about speciation, and I would like to ask whether from a genetic perspective, do you think speciation is actually possible? And if it really happens, then how do you define a species in order to know that a new species has occurred? And even maybe going beyond speciation, is it possible for a creature to evolve into a completely different kind of creature? For example, from a bird to an elephant, or from bacterium to a human? And what is the probability of probability of such an event occurring?
好，玉涵的问题哈，他是说是他这个是学生物的哈，已经有20年了哈。那他问说是这个物种的问题了哈。那是否是这个来去那个归类物种是否是可能的事情？那如何去知道新的物种会出现？那再来就有没有可能是这个从一个物种可以进化到另外一个物种？好 ，Praveen。
Yeah, thank you. Great question. The answer to this question will probably take much longer. At least a thorough answer to this question will take much longer than the 2 minutes that we have left. So I will quickly tell you, for not only answers to all of these kinds of questions, but also the potential theological implications of the answers to those questions. One of the best resources I can guide you to is BioLogos. This is an organization based out of the US that is focused on demonstrating the harmony between science and faith. But one of the main topics that they tackle is evolution and speciation and many of the related topics to the question that you've asked. So if you go to biologos.org, you will be able to find a lot of information written by people of devout faith, but also people who study evolution. But the short answer is yes. The study of genetics has very strongly and powerfully led to the inference of speciation. And indeed, we can even observe it to some extent, depending on how we define speciation. For example, if the identification of a new species is essentially one that is not able to mate productively with the species it derived from, then one might say that a new species has emerged, even if to our naked eye they may look very similar, right? So a lot of really nice experiments in the lab have been done to grow fruit flies under different conditions, such that over the course of a few generations, and these kinds of experiments are easier to do in organisms like fruit flies because their generational time is very short. And so one can actually, in a period of months or years, we can study these kinds of organisms and raise them up in different enough environments in reproductive isolation that allows new species to emerge where they cannot even mate with each other anymore, even though they came from the original same stock, right? If you expand that in the natural world, that's the kind of speciation that we're talking about, is that isolation from one another geographically and reproductively, most importantly, limits gene flow. That allows those species to sort of change and evolve separately to a point where they are no longer able to reproductively interact, at least in a productive manner, bringing about fertile offspring. So the answer is yes. Very quickly to the second part of your question, that's really not how speciation works. You know, a bird doesn't become an elephant or a bacteria doesn't become a human. The changes that take place are very, very small changes that take place over an extraordinarily large period of time. Also, birds and elephants are existing at the same time. They may have a common ancestor that no longer exists, but a bird doesn't turn into an elephant. There's just something way in the past that may have led to the eventual speciation of those species. But a bird doesn't become an elephant or a bacteria doesn't become a human. That's not how it works. But as I said, going to biologos.org, which has been placed in the chat here, you can find much, much more information on this topic. And I'm more than happy if people have questions and want to reach out to me. I'm happy to help more if I can.
OK， 谢谢 Praveen 哈，他说是其实这个问题需要更长的时间有所回复了，但是这个 biologos.org 在美国的这个机构是主要的任务呢，是来去探讨科学跟信仰的一些相关的议题哈，是极力的推荐哈，如果是要深入了解的话，但是呢想这个还是回应一下哈，这个答案是的哈，这个确实是从一个物种到另外一个物种呢是有可能的哈，比如说这个这些fruit flies 哈，这个就是苍蝇哈，那是可以从一个物种就是一个 generation 到另外 generation 好，是可以是以月或者是年哈，简单说是比较短的时间。好，所以如果你把一个物种在一个环境中有所让它去长大，但是呢适当的隔离，好，那你会看到是它的这个繁殖面上呢会有所改变的。好，那但是在人类的角度来看呢，其实就是一些相当的缓慢的，是经过相当长的时间的。好，那我们也不会看到说鸟变成是大象，或者是相反，也不会看到说是这个从人到任何的这个细菌哈，那都不会看到这样的事情的哈。但是我还是要说，这个还是建议这个 biologos 的这个网站可以更深入的有所探讨这样的议题。OK，Thank you, Praveen。好，我们必须要有所去做个结束了哈，因为时间也差不多了。非常感谢许多的这个同学跟人士啊有所去发问。